I'm Chuck Rosina.
And I'm Linda Pinkow. Together we produce No Censorship Radio and run the news department at WMBR. It's our unpaid job to bring Pacifica Radio to you every weeknight at 6 p.m. Pacifica Radio is the nation's first listener-supported, community-based radio network. Unlike other public radio, Pacifica is non-corporate, not beholden to any big institutions. As a result, they have to struggle financially, but they also have the freedom to really consider all things.
Pacifica News consistently covers the stories that are censored by the mainstream press. One example is Mumia Abu-Jamal. The commercial media barely touched the story, and when they did, they consistently referred to him as a convicted cop killer. National Public Radio considered running his commentaries live from death row, but canceled them under pressure. Another example is Fidel Castro's recent visit to New York. Mainstream media focused on how he looked and the comments made by Mayor Giuliani. Castro's speech was hardly rated a soundbite, but Pacifica aired the entire speech from the United Nations.
The money raised this evening will help to pay the costs for WMBR in Cambridge to broadcast the Pacifica News. WMBR is community radio at MIT. Although MIT provides us with studio space and some other amenities, most of our operating budget comes directly from our listeners, not through advertisers, underwriters, or the government. This means that our primary responsibility is to the listener. WMBR has grown and thrived over the years because our listeners are looking for independent voices.
Well, the obvious way to start a talk on democracy and the right to know is perhaps to try to find the least controversial comment that you can dig up about it. And the best I could do was a letter by James Madison toward the end of his life, around 1822, when he says that a popular government without popular information or the means for acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both. Well, that sounds fair enough, and one might ask who could disagree with that. There are people, for example, James Madison, not in so many words, but in principle. And that contradiction tells us quite a lot about American democracy and about the media. James Madison, as you know, was the leading figure in the framing of the Constitution, and in the debates leading to the Constitutional Convention debates, he emphasized that democracy is a problem. It's a threat to be overcome, and the new government has to be designed to bar that threat. The reason democracy is a threat, he stressed, is because the primary responsibility of government, I'm quoting, is to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. And plainly, if democracy functions, that's going to be hard to do, in fact, impossible to do. So he argued forcefully and, in fact, persuasively, and in the Constitutional Convention of 1787, that view achieved the virtually unanimous agreement of the framers of the Constitution. There was actually only one exception. And so the system was designed to protect the minority of the opulent from the majority and to ensure that there would be no threat of democracy. The ways in which this has been done are or should be well known. There have been many changes over the past couple of centuries, but that principle remains pretty much in force, and it has a consequence. The consequence is that there is no right to know. Rather, there is a need to control and manage opinion, because that's the only way to guarantee that the minority, the opulent, will be protected from the majority who otherwise might act in their own interest, and that's unacceptable. Well, there's a lot more to say about that, but let's move right on to the 20th century. By that time, a lot had changed. One thing that had changed was that extensive popular struggles and resistance had quite considerably extended the scope of democracy. One reflection of that is the extension of the franchise, and there are many others. However, while this was going on, something else was happening, namely actual decision-making power was being more and more concentrated. In fact, it was being concentrated in corporate institutions that are totalitarian in essence and were designed to protect power, protect the minority, the opulent, from market discipline, and large part of their point. And they were also being, by the early 20th century, being granted extraordinary powers by courts and by government, which had become more than ever the shadow cast by business over society, to borrow the phrase of John Dewey, a truism that simply echoed and restated in the mid-20th century points that had been made by many pre-capitalist and anti-capitalist thinkers, Adam Smith, many others, including, incidentally, James Madison, who, which again reveals some of the contradictions, a few years after the system that he had designed was in place, he was appalled by the outcome, and he condemned what he called the daring depravity of the times as the rising business classes, contrary to his expectation, used their power to become what he called the tools and tyrants of government, overwhelming it with their power and combinations and benefiting from its largesses. Take away the poetic rhetoric, and it's a pretty good description of everything that holds right up till today. In fact, today's Congress is one of the most dramatic examples of that American history reveals. Not the first one, but a dramatic one. Well, what was happening in the 20th century was captured rather neatly by Alex Carey. He's an Australian social scientist who actually pioneered the study of corporate propaganda, business propaganda. That's a huge force in modern life. It extends from the commercial media to the huge entertainment industry, to the enormous public relations industry, to advertising, schools, universities, in fact, about every aspect of modern life on quite a remarkable scale. Fortunately for us, its leaders tell us what they're up to. They are engaged in what they call the everlasting battle for the minds of men, who have to be indoctrinated with the capitalist story. That's just standard sample from leaders of the public relations industry talking to each other, of course. And that position is correct on the principle on which the country was founded. If the minority, the opulent, are to be protected against the minority, the majority, and if the threat of democracy is to be deterred somehow, then this is really the only way. Force isn't available and at an appropriate level, and even if it were, control over opinion is the fundamental means for ensuring that people accept rule, whether it's a military society or a totalitarian society or a more or less free society. Again, that's a truism that goes back to the same years, to David Hume's principles of government, in fact. So all that hangs together. Carey, describing the 20th century, points out that the 20th century has been characterized by three developments of great political importance: the growth of democracy, the growth of corporate power, and the growth of corporate propaganda as a means of protecting corporate power against democracy. That's a pretty accurate summary, I think, and he gives a lot of evidence to back it up. And we might simply add that the idea of constructing what he calls a propaganda-managed democracy is not only fully in accord with the principles on which the country was founded, but also with the thinking of leading intellectuals, progressive intellectuals, Wilsonian thinkers, academic scholars, and so on, right through the 20th century, in fact, right up till the present. The founder of one of the real founders of contemporary political science, Harold Lasswell, argued that we should not succumb to what he called democratic dogmatisms about men being the best judges of their own interests. They are not. In fact, because of the stupidity of the average man, we have to make sure that they don't try to exercise their their technical options in a democratic arena. Rather, we, the smart guys, have to do it for them. And that's just for their own benefit. Any slaveholder would understand the logic. And it's familiar, in fact. The dean of modern American journalism, Walter Lippmann, one of the leading and most respected public intellectuals of the 20th century, and a Wilsonian progressive, he explained that in a democracy, the general population, what he called the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders, have to be kept out of trouble. In a democracy, they can be spectators, he said, but not participants. Rather, they have to be marginalized and dispersed so that the bewildered herd, as he referred to the general public, will not interfere with the work of the responsible men, people like him. Like others who have advocated these elevated ideas, he politely and wisely refrained from asking why he is among the responsible men, but not, say, Eugene Debs, who in fact was in jail. But the answer is not too hard to figure out, so I'll leave it as exercise for the reader. Well, there's a lot more to say about all these things, but the most important fact, I think, is that the basic principles have not really received a very substantial challenge. In fact, they get reiterated over and over in one or another form, often publicly and overtly, as in the examples I gave, often more significantly in actual practice. The basic principle is that the democracy is a threat, has to be stopped somehow. You can have democratic forms, but you have to make sure they don't function in such a way as to threaten the minority of the opulent and their power. And that means that the bewildered herd have to be kept that way. And furthermore, though it's true that this is, in Madison's terms, a prologue to a farce or a tragedy under the cynical name of popular democracy, nevertheless, that's the ideal. It's the ideal that must be sought. There's no right to know, there is a right to manage, and indeed a duty to manage the minds of men if we are to carry out successfully this everlasting battle to ensure that we control what they think. And keep them out of trouble, out of the political arena, separated from one another, lacking exactly the capacities that Howard Zinn was talking about in those introductory remarks. There are, of course, conflicting values. That's a very important fact. And these are expressed, for example, in Madison's letter, and you find them running all the way through to the present. And the conflict between these conflicting values, that's been a central theme in the vicissitudes of democracy over the past several centuries, and it remains so. Well, let's descend from this high plane of abstraction and come down to practice, actual practice in the doctrinal institutions, of which the media are the ones most commonly discussed, but that's only because they're the most visible component and the easiest one to discuss. I think what you find in analysis of the media is rather general throughout the doctrinal system, journals of opinion, schools, universities, and so on. Some variation, but the major themes don't seem to me at least to vary very much. There's a lot of material on this topic in print, including studies that are about as carefully controlled as the empirical conditions allow. In my view, these studies demonstrate fairly persuasively that there is a systematic, sustained, and dedicated commitment to retain, to entrench the tragic farce of popular government without popular information that you can figure out for yourselves. There's lots of material to look at, and I won't try to review it. It would be impossible anyway, and a waste of time because you can do it better on your own if you're interested. So instead of trying to summarize what's available, let's just take a few samples. I've been asked to talk about this topic for many, many years, and I've always found that the best way to proceed, and the one that eliminates the legitimate charge of selectivity in examples as much as possible, is to just take whatever the lead story is. in the preceding several days. That usually works quite well, and it's not a total sample, but at least it's kind of a fair sample if you only have a few minutes. So let's take that one. Here there's no question. You don't have to worry about what the biggest story is. You don't have to count words. There has been one overwhelmingly dominant story for the last few days, the assassination of Israel's Prime Minister Rabin. That's a central topic in U.S. foreign policy and ideology and power and so on. And there's a leading question. The question is raised over and over again, will the assassination throw a wrench in the peace process? So let's have a look at that. Well, actually, remember, just to stress that I'm not really interested here in the current history, in the specifics of the current history, but rather in another question, namely how they are presented, how they're framed, how they're shaped, and what all this tells us about the everlasting battle for the minds of men and how it's waged. Well, when you look at a question like that, there's three types of questions you want to think about. One is questions of fact, how are the facts presented. Second is questions of interpretation, like what do people say about them. But a third, and usually far more interesting question, is what are the presuppositions? That is, what is unexpressed? What is the framework of discussion? What are the assumptions, the premises that bound the thinking that you're not supposed to subject to reflection or discussion, but that set the questions that can be asked in the ways you're allowed to look at them. That's almost always the most interesting and important aspect of any doctrinal system, and in case any of you are planning a future in any of these areas, that's the way to wage the everlasting battle for the minds of men. Set the presuppositions and you've won the game. So for example, in the old Soviet Union, if debate, say, over the invasion of Czechoslovakia or Afghanistan could be restricted to the question of whether the Russians acted wisely or made mistakes in their defense of Czechoslovakia and Afghanistan against terrorists and subversion. If that was the question, the game was over, and it didn't matter if you concluded that they made plenty of mistakes. Similarly, in, say, Hitler Germany, to go to the extreme, if the debate could be limited to the question of whether the Jews were indeed as much of a threat to civilized values as was claimed, or whether it was exaggerated, the game was over. It didn't matter what conclusion you drew. And that holds quite generally. Often it's reflected in the very terminology in which issues are posed. So the first question to look at, if you want to look at a doctrinal system, is just ask about how the questions are posed, what are the premises, what's beyond discussion, what's the terminology that's used, and so on. That's usually pretty much finishes the story, whether people happen to tell the truth or not. So let's take the fundamental question again. Will the assassination throw a wrench in the peace process? Well, peace process is a good thing. Everybody's in favor of peace, so therefore we're in favor of the peace process, and we hope it won't throw a wrench in it. And the answer to the question, the basic set of answers is already given. We all hope that it won't throw a wrench in the peace process, and maybe it will, and so on. That's the framework. So the next question we look at, kind of taking this external Martian view, is what is the peace process? What does it mean? What's the meaning of the term? Well, it could mean the effort to reach peace, but it certainly doesn't mean that. And in fact, really couldn't mean that if you think about it, for a very simple reason. Everyone wants peace. So Hitler wanted peace. Saddam Hussein wanted peace. Everybody wants peace on their own terms. So to say you want peace is completely meaningless. Sure, Genghis Khan would be delighted with peace as long as it was on his terms. So therefore, that's not a serious proposal. We have to look a little more closely to see what counts as a peace process. Well, within the U.S. doctrinal system, which incidentally has remarkable power around the world, it's quite an interesting fact in itself, within that doctrinal system, the term peace process has a very clear and specific meaning. It refers to whatever the U.S. government happens to be doing, very often blocking efforts to achieve peace. That, incidentally, is quite easy to show, and there's plenty of evidence for it in print in a whole variety of areas. It's a usage that has lots of useful consequences. So, for example, take the phrase, the U.S. government is working to advance the peace process. Well, that turns out to be true by definition, whatever the facts, which is kind of one nice outcome. Take the phrase, the U.S. government is trying to undermine the peace process. Well, that's meaningless, self-contradictory or meaningless, hence unthinkable, even if it's plainly true, as indeed it often is, when you understand the peace process as the effort to achieve peace. Well, that's, if you can entrench usages like that and not even get people to think about them, the game is over, as in the case of the examples I mentioned. And in fact, the peace process in the Middle East happens to be an extraordinarily dramatic example of this, of the way a really well-oiled propaganda system works. So let's begin with a couple of just plain factual observations, which are incidentally totally uncontroversial, though unthinkable. And you can check them out and hope you will. Facts of the matter are that since about 1970, the United States has stood virtually alone in the international arena in blocking diplomatic efforts to bring about a negotiated settlement to the Arab-Israeli conflict through peaceful means. That's evident, for example, from vetoes of Security Council resolutions, from solitary votes annually at the General Assembly of the United Nations, successful efforts, of course, to block initiatives from Europe, from the non-aligned countries, from the Arab states, from the PLO over many years. All of this has been the case since 1971, when the United States made a fateful decision. Henry Kissinger made a decision, namely to reverse its own policy, which had just been accepted by President Sadat of Egypt, who had offered a peace treaty through a UN negotiator, had offered a full peace treaty to Israel in exactly the terms of official U.S. policy, incidentally with nothing about the Palestinians. It was totally a rejectionist position, but happened to be exactly U.S. policy at the time. And the U.S. had to make a decision and decided to reject it. Israel also did. Now, all of this is known. So, for example, take the memoirs of Yitzhak Rabin, who was just assassinated, who was then Israeli ambassador in Washington. Well, in his memoirs, he described Sadat's 1971 offer as a famous milestone on the path to peace. Although Israel had to reject it, he said, as indeed it did. Well, what about in the United States? Well, in the United States, the famous milestone does not exist. The events did not happen. You cannot find a reference to them in the media. In fact, they're even suppressed in most of scholarship, including the most recent scholarship. They surely don't constitute any part of the peace process. Well, actually, if you think about it, that's true by definition. Since the U.S. blocked that initiative, that is, blocked the acceptance of its own official program, that can't be part of the peace process, not in the in the operative meaning of the term, and so it is excluded. And indeed, the same is true of the entire record from 1971 up till 1991. It's completely down the memory hole, unmentionable, unthinkable, and also uncontroversial. And not very hard to find out about if you choose to go to the margins or to the original documents. That's a real tribute to an intellectual class of which we are part, an intellectual class that chooses, and remember, it is, of course, a choice, to subordinate itself to power. You see it in the media. That's the easiest way to see it, but it's misleading because it's across the board. As I say, you find the same thing even in scholarship. Well, again, the facts are readily available in print if you're interested, but at the margins, in books and articles that are also unmentionable, though they're around, and then best of all in the original documents, which aren't that hard to find and are footnoted in places where it tells you where to look. Since U.S. obstruction of the peace process is self-contradictory, given the operative meaning of the term, and hence unthinkable, you don't have to proceed to ask the next question, which is why the United States has so consistently and energetically undermined the peace process since 1971. Since the idea is unthinkable, the reasons for it are unaskable. But if we break the rules, we can quickly find them. There are three basic issues that have led the United States to block every initiative from around the world, whether in the UN or elsewhere, to achieve a negotiated settlement. One reason is that the international consensus, which I stress again was virtually universal, I mean, very little deviation from this. The international consensus called for Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories occupied in 1967, and that indeed was the U.S. position too, up until 1971, when Kissinger shifted it. But since 1971, the U.S. has taken a different position in international isolation with Israel, namely that there should be only partial withdrawal as determined unilaterally by the United States and Israel, according to their decisions and interests. So that's U.S. policy, and the rest of the world had a different policy, that therefore was necessary to block every initiative, as indeed was done. Second issue arose around the mid-70s, and at that point the international consensus for the first time began to shifted away from rejectionism to acceptance of the principle that there were two national groups that were calling for national self-determination, as Israel reflected the interests of one, and then there was the indigenous population, the Palestinians. So since the mid-1970s, the same international consensus, with again near unanimity, has called for recognition of the national rights of the indigenous population alongside of Israel. And the U.S. is adamantly opposed to that, and remains so. So the United States has in fact led the rejection front, the rejectionist camp, as we would be allowed to say if we were allowed to use the word rejectionist in a non-racist fashion, but that of course is also not allowed. The third basic point, which is less familiar, these ought to be familiar, though unfortunately not. The third point would be harder to find out about, but it's been a crucial one, is that the international consensus recognizes, I'm quoting now, the right of people to resist racist and colonialist regimes and foreign military occupation. That position is unanimous, except for the United States and Israel, which voted alone at the UN a couple of years ago against the major UN resolution on terrorism. Terrorism is supposed to be something we're all, real excited about. And the UN passed one major resolution, the General Assembly. The Security Council couldn't because there the US vetoes everything. But the General Assembly passed a major resolution condemning terrorism in all its forms very strongly and so on. The US and Israel alone voted against it. One country only abstained, Honduras, so that's unanimous, essentially. I don't know, they probably had a stomachache that day or something, but in any event, that's a universal view outside of the United States and Israel, which refused to join the condemnation of terrorism because it included the passage that I just described. Now, actually, if you think back, it's around 1987, what they had in mind, actually, was South Africa, probably. That's probably the main thing that they had in mind, and the U.S. and Israel refused alone to accept the right of resistance against the racist and colonial regime or foreign military occupation, and that third issue also remains. And so that's why what is called terrorism here, quite commonly, if you look, happens to be legitimate resistance, according to the international consensus accepted outside the United States. Worth thinking about when you read about it or you listen to President Clinton, declaring that we must battle against this great plague of the modern age, as he did at the UN the other day. Well, all of that, again, is easily established. Facts are there. You can find them if you like. Also unmentionable and unthinkable. So putting this together, we discover that the peace process, the phrase peace process, refers to various U.S. efforts to block any form of political settlement that includes these three principles. And in fact, what it actually refers to is the various U.S. initiatives that have been undertaken unilaterally to achieve its own rejectionist goals in violation of the international consensus. Well, it happens that, for reasons there's no time to go into, we'll talk about it later if you like, but it happened. It happened in September 1993 in the Oslo Accords, which in fact accept precisely the U.S. rejectionist position, virtually without deviation. It was all just reaffirmed in Washington a couple of days ago, September 28th, a couple of weeks ago. On September 28th, there was a signing of what's called Oslo II, the updating of the Oslo agreements in Washington. Boston Globe headline called it a day of awe, which is pretty typical and fair enough in a way. It was quite an impressive power play and a very striking demonstration of the rule of force in international affairs and the rule of propaganda in domestic affairs, at least in well-disciplined societies like ours. And I should stress that this is worldwide. It's amazing to see how broad it is around the world. I can give you some examples if you, well, just give you one example. On Monday, I was, just this Monday, I was being interviewed by, outside the United States, of course, and one interview was by the leading journal in Brazil, you know, the leading journal, and tried to talk about some of this stuff, and the interviewer couldn't understand what I was saying, because to them, peace process means what it means in the United States. I pointed out that Brazil's own position had been exactly the contrary, and that has all been forgotten. If you look at Britain, I haven't read much of the continental press yet, but if you look at the British press, pretty much the same, not entirely, but the leading press takes exactly the same framework. This is a level of cultural dominance which is pretty astonishing, and this is by no means the only issue of it. It's an important fact, as I said. Well, that was the first question, or, you know, obviously it doesn't finish it, but there's an example of what you find when you look at the most important question, the question of presuppositions and what lies behind them and what they're excluding. Let's put that one aside for the moment and turn next to the simple question of presentation of fact. How's that work? Well, here's a sort of a sample. It's pretty typical from lead stories in the last couple of days. There's a chronology which has been reprinted all over here in Boston Globe and the international press and so on, and it refers to, of course, September 28, 1995, the Day of Awe. And here's what it says. At Oslo II, on the Day of Awe in Washington, Israel and the PLO signed an agreement extending Palestinian rule to most of the West Bank. Okay, so file that away for a moment. Take the lead story in the New York Times. It says, after the assassination, it says Yitzhak Rabin conquered the ancient lands of the West Bank and later negotiated the accord to eventually cede Israeli control of them to the Palestinians. Next one is the major think piece that the Times ran on by its leading Middle East correspondent, November 6th. He says that he describes his personal relations with Rabin over the years. He says Rabin's ideas about peace with the Palestinians underwent a remarkable transformation. It's astonishing how far he had roamed from where he stood in 1992. So there's a third one to take a look at. Well, that's typical. Let's just have a look at them. These are the three major themes reiterated over and over. Is there any truth to them? Well, that's checkable. So have a look at Oslo II. Have a look at the facts. You can find the maps. According to the maps, Israel keeps total control of 2/3 of the West Bank and effective control of virtually all the rest. In fact, all but 3%, according to high Israeli officials. In the 67%, it's total control, everything. In the rest, aside from the 3%, it's Israeli military control with local Palestinian administration, subject, however, to an Israeli veto on any decision that they decide to block. So that's, let's go back to the claim. Israel and the PLO signed an agreement extending Palestinian rule to most of the West Bank, in fact, to 3% of it, or around 30% if you include the partial control to administer under essentially foreign rule. What was ceded to Palestinian rule was a half a dozen towns, areas of heavy Palestinian population concentration, as I said, about 3% of the West Bank, according to high Israeli officials. And incidentally, these are areas that Israel has always wanted to get rid of. as has the United States urged them to get rid of them, because it's just too costly. If the New York City administration could figure out a way not to cede the South Bronx to its local inhabitants and keep, like Wall Street and the suburbs and everything else in Upper Manhattan, I'm sure they would do it in an instant. And for the same reasons, Israel has always been trying to figure out a way to cede control of the heavy population concentrations, which are costly and which would much rather have run and controlled by local security forces who are pretty much working with it, as indeed is the standard colonial model. So, for example, it's the way the British ran India, it's the way South Africa and Rhodesia ran the black areas, and so on. They didn't have to do it themselves. You get local security forces to do it for you. That's, in effect, the way the United States runs Central America. We happen to call them armies, but in fact, the way you run it is have local thugs take care of things, and you pay them off and train them and arm them and so on. If everything gets out of control, you know, well, big guy's got to move in. But this is the standard colonial model, and finally Israel managed to achieve it after giving up this costly direct control, which they've never wanted, but just couldn't figure out a way to get out of. So that's what happened in Oslo II, the Day of Awe, as far as point number one is concerned. Well, what about the Times analysis, the agreement for eventual Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank, ceding it to the Palestinians? That's a complete fabrication. There is no such agreement. You can't argue about what's in people's mind, but the documents suggest absolutely nothing of the sort. They indicate no agreement to cede anything except what Israel and the U.S. decide to cede on their own reasons. There is nothing there that suggests any intent to withdraw, and certainly any need to withdraw. So if the U.S. pays Israel, as it is now doing, to continue, meaning your tax dollars and mine, to continue settlement and development in the occupied territories anywhere it feels like, nobody can claim that Israel is violating the agreements. They are not. The agreements do not bar that in any way. If there's an intent to withdraw, it's in somebody's head. It's certainly not on paper, and Israel signed no such agreement. Let's turn to the third point, the remarkable transition in Rabin's, the astonishing change, how far he'd roamed from where he stood in 1992, his remarkable transformation, etc. Well, that you can check too. You know, he's a public figure. He says what he believes. And indeed, there has been a transformation. Prior to 1993, Rabin had consistently held what has been the Labor Party position going back to around 1968, namely that Israel should maintain control of about 40% of the West Bank, namely the usable parts. A lot of parts didn't want. That's certainly changed. Now it has 67% total control and 97% effective control, so there's been a remarkable transformation, but not quite in the direction described. The important thing to look at if you want to figure out what's going on, of course, is the facts on the ground. That determines the shape of a future settlement, as everybody knows, and including the correspondents who wrote these things, who have indeed reported on it. And in fact, as they themselves have reported, settlement and infrastructure development substantially paid by U.S. tax dollars, either directly or indirectly in various ways, that has continued, indeed increased since the Oslo Agreement. And it's a very clear form, not very obscure. The Israeli press is very honest and accurate in describing what's happening. And you get, sometimes it's reported here too, what's happening is the implementation of what was called the Sharon Plan of 1981, reiterated in a slightly different form in 1992. Now, within the spectrum of Israeli politics, there have been various proposals about what to do with occupied territories, and this is the most extreme hawkish proposal, which was proposed under the Begin government in 1981 by Ariel Sharon, as I say, reiterated in 1992, and that's what's being implemented, far right of the political spectrum. It's basically a program aiming at cantonization. That's what it's called there, in fact. break the region into separated cantons, which will be encircled by huge road systems and kept away out of sight, and the people can survive there somehow if they like, and of course, under ultimately local administration. So I assume that Israel will relinquish more than the 97% it now has. In fact, may well go back to the 40% it's traditionally wanted, taking the usable lands, the resources, primarily water, just about anything it needs, expand, and breaking the area into separate regions, into what in fact are called in Israeli commentary Bantustans. Several leading and highly respected Israeli commentators, I don't say everybody says this, have pointed out in the major journal that this is kind of like the system that South Africa imposed in the 1950s. It's not like the end of apartheid, it's like the beginning of it, with separated Bantustans established, which you'll recall were called states. Not many people recognize them, but South Africa called them states, and it's entirely possible that this region will someday be called a state if Israel, as I rather suspect, returns to its standard position, U.S. and Israel, because they work together on this, and moves back to, say, half the territory or something on that order, which would be only rational from their point of view, even on the most extreme rejectionist assumptions. That will then be described as a major and agonizing compromise, and we'll all have to, wail about how hard it is to give it up. That is, to go back to the position that they've been advocating for 20 years and have been able to maintain 25 years, almost 30 years now, and have been able to maintain with U.S. support. Well, again, that's impressive. All of the factual claims, of which I gave 3, but they're typical, all the factual claims are utterly false. There isn't any question about this. They are also going to pass without any meaningful criticism. That you can check yourself in the next couple of days and just see how much meaningful criticism there is of these outrageously false statements. I think it's a fair prediction. Facts are that Israel most definitely has not withdrawn from most of the occupied territories. It has not signed any agreement or hinted at any intention of signing any agreement to eventually cede the West Bank or even large parts of it. And as far as although, as I say, I suspect the U.S. and Israel will ultimately agree to this for other reasons. And as far as that remarkable transformation is concerned, yeah, it's a transformation towards extremism. That's the remarkable transformation, and it's pretty hard to imagine that the author of those lines doesn't know it at some level of consciousness, because he, in fact, Clyde Haberman, has reported a lot of the evidence. Well, that last point about the shift towards extremism, this remarkable transformation, that actually merits a little more closer look and tells us more about what's going on. So let's go back to the crucial period, 1988. That's the point at which both the United States and Israel refused to have any dealings whatsoever with any Palestinian organization and recognized no Palestinian rights at all. And simply, it was also at the peak of the Intifada, the popular uprising, which was put down with considerable brutality. So let's ask what the position was at that time. Extreme of rejection is 1988. Well, Rabin was defense minister at the time, and at the time he called for, as I said, keeping 40% of the West Bank by unilateral Israeli decision, in contrast to the 67% that it held under the Day of Awe Agreement, September 28th, and the 97% that it effectively controls, according to Israeli analyses. Well, that year 1988 has other relevance, which is worth thinking about. So the Boston Globe story on the assassination begins with the following sentence: "And so peace has claimed another victim, namely Yitzhak Rabin, who is a martyr for peace," President Clinton said in Jerusalem yesterday. There's an adjacent story, front page, which discusses the assassination of Anwar Sadat, a former president of Egypt, who became a hero in the United States, but it's worth remembering why. He became a hero in the United States because in 1978 he agreed to U.S. terms. His 1971 famous milestone not only didn't make him a hero, but it's out of history, because at that point the United States insisted on stalemate, as Henry Kissinger describes it, that is, insistence on no negotiations. I should say there is no secret about this. Kissinger explains carefully why he insisted on stalemate, no negotiations. Well, there are other leaders who've been assassinated, but who aren't victims of peace. In fact, one was assassinated right in 1988, at the time I'm talking about. April 1988, PLO leader Abu Jihad was assassinated in Tunis by Israeli commandos. There's no secret about that. They took pride in it. Well, he doesn't enter the pantheon of martyrs for peace, and it's fair to ask why. Well, one argument might be that he was a terrorist, which is in fact absolutely true. Terrible terrorist record. True, but plainly totally irrelevant, because that had absolutely nothing to do with why he was assassinated. And furthermore, in the craft of terrorism, he doesn't even come close to the martyrs for peace. That's including our own non-martyrs so far. That's, again, pretty easy to establish, so that can't have anything to do with the story. Yes, a terrorist, but that's transparently irrelevant. The second reason why he's not a martyr for peace could be that he opposed the peace process, which is also true in a technical sense. That is, he opposed U.S. rejectionism along with the rest of the world, and therefore he was opposing the peace process as the term is understood here. He did advocate something, but it's not the peace process. What he advocated was the position that the PLO was then trying to put forward as energetically as it could, negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians, leading to mutual recognition in some kind of two-state settlement, the exact modalities to be worked out through negotiation. That's the position that he was advocating, and therefore he was opposing the peace process because the U.S. and Israel were flatly opposed to this, refused to consider it at all. This had been going on for some years. Here, the way in which the media and indeed scholarship treat this is quite intriguing if you look. It's been well documented, not hard to find. They simply refused to report it. There were some exceptions here and there, but overwhelmingly refused to report it. The New York Times, for example, flatly refused. They would not report PLO initiatives for negotiations leading to mutual recognition. In fact, the New York Times refused to print even letters referring to it. On one occasion, the foreign editor of the New York Times actually wrote a letter to one of the writers, not me, a professor in the Midwest, explaining why it would not print his letter referring to the Arafat offers that the New York Times had refused to print. That's kind of unusual. You really let your hair down like that. But it doesn't matter. This is a very well-oiled propaganda system, so you can get away with anything, including total suppression of these facts, and even vast lying about them. The most extreme example of this is by the man who was honored for that achievement by getting his second Pulitzer Prize, Thomas Friedman, then quickly elevated to chief foreign correspondent, diplomatic correspondent. His record in lying about this is just astonishing. Again, you can look it up if you like, but it worked. So that's all out of history. The official line was then, and remains up till today, that the Palestinians were not willing to consider peace. Therefore, I just had to go on doing the things we were doing. That was just repeated yesterday in the New York Times story, explaining, running through the history, that at that time the Palestinians refused to consider peace. They were just calling for negotiations leading to mutual recognition and a two-state settlement, and they were refusing to consider peace, meaning what we call peace. So therefore, obviously, you had to just, hit them over the head and break their bones and that sort of thing. Well, facts are pretty straight, but they're irrelevant. They're irrelevant because they're inconsistent with higher truths that have to be observed. And in the everlasting battle for the minds of men, you take no quarter. Some things are too important to allow it to be said. Let's proceed. And so we might ask what the last victim of peace, Yitzhak Rabin, was doing while his commandos assassinated Abu Jihad in Tunis, who, remember, was blocking the peace process along with the rest of the world at the time because he didn't accept the U.S. rejectionist position. Well, Rabin was then defense minister, and just at that time, he was ordering his troops to attack villages that declared themselves liberated. That was one of the things that was done in the uprising. A village off in a hill somewhere would simply declare itself liberated, and Rabin ordered his troops to attack using plastic bullets. The first time they were authorized, and the reason, he explained, was, I'm quoting, because our purpose is to increase the number of wounded and to make it clear to the people of the West Bank and Gaza where they live and within which framework, so that they'll abandon any illusions of any form of self-government in a village declared liberated somewhere. That was that's what he was doing at the time. At the time, remember, the U.S. was simply denying, rejecting, pretending that there were no Palestinian offers. In the United States, it was easy to get away with that because, you know, the New York Times just wouldn't report it. But the world isn't the United States. And it was by the end of 1988, the United States was in fact becoming an object of international ridicule, public international ridicule, because of the increasingly more desperate efforts to deny the initiatives that had been coming for some years from the Palestinians and were now becoming, you know, very hard to suppress. They were suppressed here, but not elsewhere. So the U.S. entered into a last-ditch effort to try to deflect the Palestinian initiatives. They undertook a dialogue with the PLO in December 1988, and that caused some concern in Israel, but Yitzhak Rabin assured a delegation of Peace Now leaders that it didn't mean anything. It was just a delaying action intended to grant Israel a year or more to suppress the Intifada, the uprising, by harsh military and economic pressures so that the peace process could then revert to U.S.-Israeli rejectionist guidelines, which indeed is exactly what happened. So that's, there was no objection to this on the part of the Peace Now leaders, at least not reported. So accordingly, Yitzhak Rabin is a victim of peace, and Abu Jihad is a terrorist whose assassination we in fact applaud, as was done. We might ask what Washington's men of peace were saying at that time while deflecting the threat of diplomacy. The leading man of peace in Washington at that time was surely Secretary of State George Shultz, who explained to New York Times Middle East specialist Elaine Sciolino, right at that time in mid-1988, that he understood the aspirations of the Palestinians, and he gave an example to show it. He said, look, I live in California, he said, and George Bush lives in Texas, and we live in harmony. So the Palestinians of the occupied territories should have no problem whatsoever living together, you know, under whatever arrangements U.S.-Israeli power dictate. Well, that profound insight was blandly reported. It's right there, as always, and it's another contribution to the peace process. Incidentally, Schultz's position on this is completely standard, and not only in the United States, but elsewhere as well, I should say. So take one example, Fathi Shikaki, the leader of Islamic Jihad, who was assassinated in Malta a couple of weeks ago by Israeli commandos, according to the Israeli press. I don't know if it's true, but they claim that with great pride and applause. Well, if you take Fathi Shikaki's position and you replace Jews and Palestinians, interchange Jews and Palestinians, you have George Shultz's position. They're identical, you know, on non-racist assumptions, that is. They're identical. Which means that either, on non-racist assumptions, either both George Shultz and Fathi Shikaki are men of peace, or else they are both murderous terrorists who deserve their fate, which one of them got and the other one hasn't. Well, fortunately, non-racist assumptions are about as unthinkable as anything else I'm talking about, so we don't have to pursue these exercises any further. Well, maybe this was an unfair example, so try another case. Let's go back to the day before this story broke. The day before this story broke, there was a front page story on now November 4th. It was about Clinton dedicating a memorial at the Arlington National Cemetery to the memory of the victims of the terrorist bombing of Pan Am 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland. And the story goes on to explain, I'm quoting now, that the U.S. government charged 2 Libyans, but Libya refuses to turn them over for trial. The United States then imposed an embargo along with Britain and other sanctions, but some families of the Flight 103 victims have criticized the United Nations and Western allies for not putting enough pressure on Libya. That's the gist of the story. So let's turn to the facts. Fact number 1 is that Libya did offer to turn the accused over for trial, explicitly and clearly and unambiguously. Namely, it offered to turn the people charged over to an international tribunal, perhaps at The Hague, you know, the place where the international tribunals are, and with a Scottish judge. It was shot down over Scotland, or any other venue, as long as it was independent and neutral. And the U.S. refused that offer, flatly refused, insisting that the people charged, and also refused to give the evidence, that the people charged be turned over to the United States or to Britain. Now that's a demand for which there is absolutely no support in international law, and it's totally senseless. If Libya, for example, were to demand that Ronald Reagan be handed over to be tried as a war criminal for the bombing of Tripoli and Benghazi, the United States would not say, okay, fine, you know, we hand him over to Libya to be tried. And in fact, there is no country in the world that would ever accept this. That's a crazy idea, and as I say, has no support in international law. If you're serious about it, you go to some international, relatively independent venue, say The Hague with a Scottish judge. Well, the fact then is, to be precise, that the U.S. is trying to prevent a trial to which Libya has agreed. That is the clear and unambiguous fact. And again, contrary to the news report, the families of the victims are well aware of this. Now here you have to be a little more careful. There are 2 organizations of families of victims. There's one in the United States and there's one in Britain, shot down over Scotland, remember. Plenty of victims on both sides, and there are 2 family organizations. The U.S. family organization accepts the U.S. version, as far as I know, without question. The British family organization rejects it, rejects the U.S.-UK version. They protest the fact publicly and very vigorously, protest the fact that the United States and Britain are trying to prevent a trial of Libyans, and they even suggest a reason why. The reason they suggest is that Libya is a scapegoat and an easy punching bag when you want to deflect a real inquiry. And they also point out the obvious, that if there is a real inquiry at an independent tribunal, namely something which the U.S. and Britain are desperately trying to prevent, if there is a tribunal, it's going to explore the idea about Pan Am 103 that instantly comes to mind. Whether it's right or not, we don't know, but it's certainly the one that instantly comes to mind. And that is that the terrorist bombing of Pan Am 103 was a retaliation for the destruction of Iran Air 655 in July 1988. It was shot down by the U.S. Vincennes, a military vessel in the Gulf, with 290 people killed, and that was a significant event. It's what finally convinced Iran to sort of capitulate to the terms of U.S. ally Saddam Hussein. Well, this has been studied. There are 2 important studies of this in the U.S. Naval Institute proceedings, which you can read if you like. The most recent one, the first one by a commander of another naval vessel right adjacent to the Vincennes, and the second one by retired Marine Colonel David Evans, recently. And they point out some interesting things. These studies, this is the U.S. Naval Institute proceedings, you know, not talking about some marginal rag. It concludes that the airliner was shot down unambiguously over Iranian territorial waters in what was clearly a commercial air corridor. There was no ambiguity about that. They conclude further that the naval inquiry that was held was a complete cover-up for what may have been, they suggest, a deliberate atrocity. They conclude further that George Bush's testimony at the United Nations was an outright lie throughout, and, quote, our Navy is too dangerous to deploy, in the words of an Army colonel who attended the hearings. Well, Bush proceeded to, George Bush, then President, awarded the commander and other officers medals for their achievements, the only real achievement being shooting down this commercial airliner. And he announced publicly, "I will never apologize for the United States of America. I don't care what the facts are." Well, that's plainly a story that's better kept under wraps, here at least, not entirely in Britain. So under pressure from the families of the victims, a documentary on Pan Am 103, which questions the official version, a documentary by Alan Frankovich, a well-known filmmaker. That documentary, under pressure from the families, was shown at the House of Commons in London and was shown over BBC, national television. I met the head of the British group of families a couple months ago, and he informed me that PBS had refused to run it, and of course commercial television. But in England it's been shown over BBC and in the House of Commons. Now, the crucial facts about this story. One is it's the United States that's blocking a trial, not Libya. Two, there's an ugly story in the background, which may or may not be related, but is sure to come out if there is a trial, which suggests why the U.S. may be so adamant in objecting to a trial and blocking it. A third point, which ought to come to anybody's mind at once, is that Iran is accused of every terrorist act that takes place anywhere, no matter whether there's any evidence or not, with one striking exception, namely the one for which it very likely is responsible, namely the bombing of Pan Am 103, which plausibly might be a retaliation for the shooting down of Iran Air 65, or at least one might imagine. And that fact is recognized, at least in Britain. A free press would immediately ask some questions about all these things, not simply feature stories that are an insult to the victims, as again is recognized, at least in Britain. Well, these are foreign affairs. What about domestic coverage? No time, it's late, but if you look, you'll find it's pretty much the same, in my opinion. There's plenty of material on that, too. Notice that all of this, I think it's a fairly standard pattern, and it conforms rather well to leading doctrines about democracy and the right to know. So it's not at all surprising, and of course it's in the interests of those who control the doctrinal system. So it's not a big surprise. Now, of course, it would be absurd to claim that that's all one finds in the commercial or national media. Obviously, that's not true. Nevertheless, the pattern is pretty significant, as I think you find if you look closely. You don't look that closely. Independently of this, there is a tradition in the United States, a very important tradition of an independent press. In the mid-19th century, right around here, in fact, in the mill towns and Lowell and Lawrence and so on, there was a very lively and rather quite substantial independent press. It was run by artisans, what were called factory girls, young women off the farms who were working in the Lowell mills and so on. This is, the rise of the American industrial system. They had a press that they ran themselves. Very interesting reading, smart, thoughtful. They condemned what they called the new spirit of the age, gain wealth, forgetting all but self, which they regarded as a degrading and demeaning doctrine that had to be combated. They condemned what they called the state of servitude to which free people are being reduced by rising industrial capitalism, and they demanded that those who work in the mills ought to own them. They condemned the destruction of democracy and freedom and culture, in fact, as monarchical principles are being established on democratic soil. They also denounced what they called the bought priesthood, that is, the intellectuals who serve the masters. Well, the scale of that was quite substantial. In fact, even up to early in this century, it was not very different from the scale of the commercial capitalist press. It declined through the 20th century. Though as late as the 1950s, there were still about 800 labor papers around the country, reaching about 20, 30 million people, and they were seeking to combat a huge corporate offensive that was at that time underway to sell the American people on the virtues of big business, as they put it. They also sought, I'm quoting still, to expose, this is the 1950s, to expose racial hatred and all kinds of undemocratic words and deeds, to provide antidotes to the worst poisons of the kept press, namely the commercial media, which have the task of damning labor at every opportunity while carefully glossing over the sins of the banking and industrial magnates who really control the nation. This is all as American as apple pie, has nothing to do with Marxism or socialism or anything else, goes right back to the origins of American democracy and republicanism. And it's right in the mainstream, I should say, if at least people are the mainstream. And all of this indeed is, if you think about it, echoes James Madison's lament about the system that he had constructed as soon as he saw how it was working. That is, the daring depravity of the times as business became the tool and tyrant of government. Well, over time, the concentrated power of the private tyrannies has largely eliminated the independent media, and we're now seeing the consequences every day. Well, as always, all throughout this period, there's been plenty of resistance, and that resistance often achieved quite a lot, not in recent years as well. And as always, there remain endless opportunities to reverse these tendencies. Support for the independent media is one of many parts of this task. There are plenty of others. It's obviously not going to happen by itself. That's one thing we can be sure of. And I think we can be pretty confident that if events continue on their present course, the future is going to be bleak. But if we're honest, we'll recognize that that choice is our own to make. Thanks.
If there are any questions, if people could line up by the microphones to ask them, we'd appreciate that. Thank you.
I'd like to ask a question that's kind of a large question, I guess. You were pointing out that organizations that vie for change choose to subordinate themselves to power, and then and the often construct that this manifests what we call respectability. But I was wondering if that choice is an interesting play of words.
Is what? I'm sorry, if the choice is what?
Is that an interesting play of words? But that's not my question, really. But and I see that in its origins, it seems to not be so much a free choice, so much as a reasonable move when groups suddenly understand that federal groups like COINTELPRO will not allow them to make broad changes. Thus, it seems like there's only one way, taking on the values and mindset of the dominant power. So do you believe that this is
just a reasonable choice?
And do you believe, is there any history of any group that has not made this sort of compromise in the U.S.?
Yeah, every group, in fact. The U.S. has a very violent labor history, totally different from Europe. In fact, it was so violent, this goes right into in the late 1930s, American workers were getting murdered by private armies and security forces. This just appalled the right-wing press in Europe, but it didn't stop people from organizing the CIO. In fact, I hear this all the time. It's very striking. I travel around the country and the world a lot giving talks, and this is one question I hear in the United States frequently. Freest society in the world, by comparative standards, the society in which the capacity of the state to coerce is less than anywhere else in the world, at least that I know of. And here I constantly hear people say, look, we just can't face the violence of the state. Well, look, let's take the opposite extreme in the hemisphere, Haiti, poorest country in the hemisphere. Well, I was there for a couple of days at the height of the terror, and that was no joke. It wasn't, well, yeah, they had COINTELPRO and they killed a couple of people. That was mass murder, and people were scared out of their wits, and you walk through the streets of the slums and you could see the terror in people's eyes. But nobody was saying, look, we got to give up. I mean, maybe somebody in the government might not like us or something like that. It's only in the United States that you hear this, generally from pretty privileged people, I should say, which is striking. Yes, there's problems, no doubt. I mean, COINTELPRO did exist. If you were poor, if you're a black organizer in the slums, It could, and in one case, exactly one case over 15 years did lead to a murder set up by the FBI and using the Chicago police. If you were relatively privileged and white, you could get called bad names. It's about what it amounted to. Like I was on Nixon's enemies list, you know. In fact, I was a friend of mine and I teaching a course at MIT were targeted by COINTELPRO. We discovered this when court cases came along and they you know, had to release documents to people who were targeted. Okay, we were targeted at MIT. It was such an attack that we didn't even know about it. And in fact, there was an effort to try to disrupt and prevent the political course that we were teaching and various techniques. In fact, it also turned out that the whole incident was fabricated. Nothing happened. It was invented by the FBI office in Boston. Had a lot of documents up and back from J. Edgar Hoover in Washington, you know, authorizing it and then telling all the wonderful things they're doing and so on. None of it ever happened. And I presume I actually asked a FBI defector once what all this kind of stuff is about. And he kind of laughed and he said, look, everybody has a caseload. And you have to have, like, say, I don't know, 40 people on your caseload or something. Well, you know, you pick somebody from the mafia, it's not too pleasant, they shoot back and so on. If you pick something like this or you make it up or something, well, then, you know, it's kind of convenient life. So, you know, I don't want to say that's all that goes on, but for people in the United States to talk about repression isn't even a joke.
I would agree with you, but I just wondered would it have anything to do with people being so socialized, indoctrinated, or whatever? And also, you were in an institution. I know people who've been beat up by police for doing political things.
Yeah, I've been places where people like Howard Zinn get beat up by the police.
Right.
Sure, but and in fact, you know, I was in and out of jail and had my own problems, but all of these are things that people are asking for. You know, it's not it's not that somehow this is repression. It's not very pretty, you know, and sometimes you really do get hurt and so on. But these are people who are, you know, privileged enough, as we all are, to make use of the very substantial freedom that exists, and of course face some problems. And depending on who you are, you'll face different kind of problems. But none of them are very severe. I mean, that goes as far as the Black Panthers. They did get a pretty rotten treatment, and a lot were killed. But, you know, compared with what happens just about anywhere else, it was pretty mild. It's true the United States has a violent history, including a violent history of state repression by the standards of Western industrial societies. But remember what those standards are. You might be quite right that people are, in fact, I'm sure you are right in thinking people are socialized into believing this here. So people here do feel that it's just too dangerous. But if you compare that feeling with the reality that they face, that tells you something else about doctrinal systems. You know, you just compare it with, say, the slums in Port-au-Prince. Okay.
You mentioned the Lockerbie bombing and how the headlines went, but should get to the bottom of the act of terrorism or bring terrorists to justice. On that note, I know that the U.S. has had issues with Libya, at least since Gaddafi nationalized the oil fields. And I was wondering about it making the headlines, which were sort of overshadowed by the assassination headlines this weekend. Do you think Libya is again being set up as a scapegoat? Because we all realize that the United States has to always have enemies or potential military targets. Mm.
Well, actually the story about Libya was the day before the assassination, so I don't want to mislead you into thinking there was a connection. It was, in fact, the anniversary of the Lockerbie bombing, so those two things are quite independent. But your point is not only right, but, you know, well supported. I mean, when the Reagan administration came in, right away, they recognized that they were going to need some enemies. I mean, it didn't take a genius, even in 1981, to realize that what John F. Kennedy called the monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that's planning to take over the world was looking a little less dangerous, and it wouldn't be, you know, maybe he didn't know when it was going to disappear, but it's going to be a pretty hard sell. If you wanted to, say, invade Central America, which is what they intended, you're going to have some enemies around, real enemies. So right away, instantly, in fact, even before they came in, they announced that the major interest of foreign policy would be to defend the United States against international terrorism. And they immediately set up Libya. Right through the 1980s, there were fabricated confrontations with Libya invented stories. You know, you may remember, it must have been around 1981 or 82. This started in 81, summer of 81. Every single time the press reported, you know, the Libyan danger and atrocity, and then 6 months later, same press reported in small print, well, you know, seems to have been a disinformation campaign and so on. But the next time it came around, same story. There was even one case which was so comical you could hardly keep a straight face. They had tanks surrounding the White House because, you know, Libyan hitmen were wandering around going to, remember that? That was like 1981 or two. Everybody in the world was laughing hysterically, but here everybody took it seriously. In fact, every time that a confrontation was set up with Libya, the tourist industry collapsed in Europe, literally, because this connects with your point about the socialization. Americans were just afraid to travel, you know, because maybe some Arab would be looking at them somewhere. And this happened this is a very frightened society, but as another effect of the tremendous indoctrination, is indeed a very frightened society. And these things were just fabricated over and over again. And consciously, you know, there's one fraud after another, and Libya is a very convenient punching bag. I mean, nobody likes Gaddafi. You know, nobody's going to defend them. You know, a little country, can't shoot back. It's just perfect. You know. So yes, it was set up over and over. I'm sure in fact, at the time of the, there certainly have been atrocities. Actually, you can look through Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch reports, and you'll find Libyan terror and atrocities and torture and so on. But you know, it's nowhere near our friends. I mean, it doesn't even come close, not to speak of us. But that doesn't matter. This is a well-oiled propaganda system. So your point's right, and I think it's well documented. But I don't think that's what happened this time. You know, on the Lockerbie bombing, you know, the Pan Am bombing, I suspect that the British families group is on the right track. That the main purpose, at least in preventing an inquiry, the main U.S. purpose in preventing any inquiry into it is to try to keep this background story out of sight. Now, whether that's a key to the Lockerbie bombing or not, I don't know. I have no idea. But there's no doubt that any independent inquiry is immediately going to start looking at it. And even if they don't connect it to the Pan Am 103 bombing, they're going to bring out a lot of things that are better left in the pages of the U.S. Naval Institute proceedings. You know?
I have two questions about political details of your talk. First is, I wonder, you indicated that the Israeli press is reasonably truth-speaking, and I wonder then why the radical right in Israel hated Rabin so much and wanted him dead, as NPR wanted.
Oh yeah, that's absolutely true. In fact, take a look at the United States, and you know the opposition to him is very strong in the Jewish community. In fact, a good bit of the radical right in Israel is American.
Well, if you know the press is truth-speaking in Israel,
well, you know, by comparative standards, on this issue they have a reasonably good record. The Hebrew press, this isn't only. I'm not talking about the English language press, which is for American reporters. I'm talking about the Hebrew press, which is secret language for internal use.
Well, they must have reported though that, you know.
Oh, the right-wing stuff? Oh, all over the place. In fact, you know, I get the Hebrew press a couple of weeks late, naturally, so I've just been reading the stuff that was going on in September and so on. And the reports of the hysterical attacks on Rabin and the calls for him to be killed. Actually, this morning in the New York Times, you can read an op-ed by Zev Chafetz, who's actually an American, who was a press attaché there for years, who calls for doing something to silence the rabbis who have been calling for Rabin's death in Israel. And it's been perfectly open there.
But why were they calling for his death if he
because, look,
40% to 97%?
Because they want 100%. No matter how extreme you are, there's going to be somebody who wants more. If you want to know what people really want, there's two political groupings in Israel, Labor and Likud. The Likud party, its core is Cherut. You know, Menachem Begin's group goes back to the, you know, old Irgun Tzai Leumi and so on. For those of you who know this stuff, that's the core of the opposition. As late as the mid-'80s, they had still not renounced their claim to Jordan, and they stated explicitly that they will not renounce Israel's claim to Jordan, namely that that's part of their land, though they won't act right now to realize that claim. Actually, that's also been true of the Labor Party. So the kibbutz movement, which is sort of considered the left of the Labor Party, more than half of it is a group with the biggest kibbutz movement. Its position was that Israel controls both Jordan as well, though they said, yeah, we don't implement it. Now, I'm not sure. I've never seen anything to indicate whether they've officially abandoned these positions. As far as I know, they haven't. But there's always somebody who wants more. You know, in fact, if they give up, let's say Sharon, who's at the extreme right, you know, in the spectrum, his plan, which is pretty much what's being implemented, gave up a lot. Menachem Begin, you know, right wing of the spectrum, yeah, he withdrew from the Sinai, his initiative. So there are people who, you know, within the spectrum, which is not, you know, zero, I mean, it's narrow, but not zero, there are more extremist and less extremist elements, but there are even more extremist elements outside.
And I also wanted to know, and this is more general, why is the U.S. so in bed with Israel then? I mean,
So what?
So in bed. I mean, it seems like...
It's the other. Look, Israel performed services. I mean, that's another whole story, and I didn't want to look at the history now. But if you look at it, there's actually a record on this. And in fact, people argue, you know, about what the real reasons are. And here we're in the area of interpretation. But just to give you my own interpretation, and I've given what I think is a lot of evidence. You can read and figure it out for yourself. I basically agree with what's called the strategic asset theory. You know, the theory that Israel has been considered a strategic asset. The United States doesn't care one way or another about Israel. If Israel gets out of line, they'll be down the tube in 3 seconds, like everybody else. But the main interest of the United States in the region is control over the oil production. That has been the main interest since the 1940s, unquestionably.
But the Arabs have the oil.
No, but don't forget that, see, you got to remember how this works. Here we have to decode the system and look at what is actually said. It's said, you know. It's not the Arabs who control the oil. The U.S. took over from the British a certain way of ensuring that the profits from oil come back to the West and don't go to the people of the region. That's the main issue. The way of doing it is to set up what the British called an Arab facade, behind which the British would rule. So very weak family dictatorships who are so weak that they'll do whatever you tell them. The main thing they'll do is ensure that the enormous wealth of the region does not go to the people of the region, but goes to London and New York and so on. That's a picture that the U.S. just took over from the British in the 40s when the U.S. essentially took over the region. Well, there's a problem. The people of the region are kind of stupid and don't understand why their wealth shouldn't go to them, why it should go to people in, you know, London and New York. And since they can't get this simple idea through their heads, you have to have somebody protecting the Arab facade from the domestic populations of the region. Well, that requires force, you know. And the best idea is local gendarmes, regional powers, typically non-Arab, because they can kill Arabs more easily, apparently. So, and besides, usually more efficient because of the history and so on. So you find non-Arab states which will protect the facade. And there's been a ring of them. Turkey is one, Pakistan has been another, Iran under the Shah was another, Israel was another, and in fact, in 1960s, and in fact, you can find this right in the records. You know, back to 1948, the Joint Chiefs of Staff were reporting that they were very impressed with Israel's military prowess in 1948, and they describe Israel as a natural base for U.S. power in the region, second only to Turkey at the time, they said. Now, in 1956, Israel got out of line. They joined with enemies of the United States, namely France and England, in doing something that the United States didn't want at that time, and they got kicked in the face very fast, you know, pushed right out. That wasn't the job. But within a couple of years, got better. You can read in the National Security Council reports, which are now declassified, that a rational consequence of U.S. opposition to radical Arab nationalism would be to support Israel as the only reliable base for U.S. power in the region. Well, then it goes on. In 1967, with Israel's tremendous victory over Nasser, who they really were worried about, an independent nationalist, the alliance gets firmed up very tight because now Israel was recognized as the dominant military force. Furthermore, Israel was pretty much an alliance with the Arab oil family dictatorships. Now, you can't show that because those are dictatorships and they don't have documents, but it's certainly been the assumption of the highest placed American officials. So, for example, Senator Henry Jackson, who was the Senate's leading specialist on the Middle East and on oil for years, and a smart guy, he, back in 1971 or so, he pointed out, I think certainly correctly, that the U.S. strategic framework in the region rested on a tacit alliance between, which is a tripartite alliance between Saudi Arabia, the biggest of the Arab, oil dictatorships, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Israel. Iran was then under the Shah. Now, technically, Saudi Arabia was at war with both Iran and Israel, but that was only technical, and everybody knew that's nonsense. In fact, Israel and Iran had a very close relationship. How close it was only came out after the fall of the Shah and only came out in Israel with plenty of documentation. Again, that's not much discussed here, but they had a very close alliance. The U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency has also by now published enough information to back this up, and the picture was, I think, correct, and someday we'll even make it to scholarship, that there was a tripartite alliance between the two big military forces, Israel and Iran, under the Shah, remember, and they were protecting Saudi Arabia and all the Gulf principalities basically against an indigenous threat. And there were plenty of them. There were about a dozen uprisings in Saudi Arabia in the 60s, and of course there were pressures from the nationalist forces in the region, like Egypt. And so it goes. I mean, when the Shah fell in 1979, you could just predict, if you knew what was going on, you predict right off that right away Saudi Arabia and Israel are going to be working with the United States to try to restore the Shah's regime, because that would restore the arrangement. That's precisely what happened. It's called here the Iran Gate or something, and there's a whole story about hostages and so on, but we know that had nothing to do with it. I mean, the U.S. arms sales to Iran via Israel, funded by Saudi Arabia, began instantly, and there were no hostages. Okay, so it couldn't have had to do with hostages. It's impossible. There were no hostages. It had to do with perfectly obvious purpose, and in fact, in Israel, they were quite frank and open about it. In fact, so frank and open, it was even reported in a major documentary over BBC back in 1981, long before any hostages, in which the Israeli former, they call him ambassador, what amounted to the ambassador to Iran, Uri Librani, simply announced that on British television, he said, look, what we're trying to do is to find Iranian officers who'd be willing to shoot down 10,000 people in the streets. And if we can find them, we can restore the arrangement that existed before. And that's the purpose of selling arms. I mean, that's why you sell arms to a country, to maintain relations with the military. And in fact, if there's a civilian government you don't like, those are exactly the people you're trying to get at. That's how they overthrew Allende. That's what happened in Indonesia. It's just standard operating procedure. So that happened from the early 80s. It didn't work, because, not everything works. And then it sort of tails off for various reasons into what got exposed here as arms for hostages, which probably had nothing to do with the matter. This is a story that's been going on for a long time. It makes sense. If you have to protect the facade by force. Meanwhile, over the years, the relations of dependency between Israel and the United States are extraordinary. There's nothing like it in world affairs. And in return for the huge payments that the United States makes, Israel just began to perform lots of services elsewhere. So when, if the U.S. this became quite significant in the 1970s, when Congress, under popular pressure, is one of the things that came out of the 60s, began to put human rights conditions on U.S. executive actions. Well, terrorism, of course, has to continue, and if you can't do it openly, you need surrogates. So they turned to surrogates, and in fact the U.S. in the 80s set up the world's biggest, I mean just the most colossal international terrorist network that the world has ever seen. Other countries hire terrorists, but the U.S. is a big guy. We hire terrorist states. So the Reagan terrorist network, which was at work, say, in Central America, and not only there, included Saudi Arabia, Taiwan, Israel, which was a main element, British intelligence worked, and so on and so forth. It was a big international terrorist network of unprecedented proportions and very devastating. And Israel's very efficient in that. U.S. was blocked from direct participation in what amounted to genocide in Guatemala because Congress wouldn't let them participate directly, and the public simply wouldn't permit it. They tried, and there was big public reaction, so they turned to Israel. Those are services, pay for them. In fact, there's a lot of, if you read the Israeli press, the more, even quite conservative commentators find this extremely degrading and are very critical of it. In fact, one of Israel's leading satirists, who's a pretty conservative guy, had a column once on what he called the strategic cooperation. He said strategic cooperation means you order your dog to bite somebody and then you throw him a bone. That's called strategic cooperation, U.S. and Israel. They don't like it, but they've decided to accept this form of dependency in return for maintaining control over the territories. I mean, as they know perfectly well, they could have had peace with Egypt in 1971. So it's not, I don't suggest this is uncontroversial. This is interpretive, so you got to look and see if that's the way the facts fall out and so on and so forth, and there's other ideas. But in my view, that's what it is, and I think it's a pretty rational policy. I also think there's every reason to believe that if Israel ever steps out of line, that's going to be the end of the moral obligation to Israel, which is that thin. The moral obligation means you do what we tell you, and then we'll have a moral obligation.
I have a general question about more like how to fish rather than ask you to hand me a fish, which is what in your average day do you do if you spent the whole day meeting with students and you want to pick up on the news? Do you listen to Pacifica? Do you have people you talk to get the latest trustworthy rumors, or do you read the New York Times and read between the lines, or?
Depends what day it is, like take today. So I spent all day with students, and then I'm here now, and when I go home I'm going to read a stack of newspapers.
All of the above? Or?
Pardon?
All of the above?
Look, you don't have a lot of choices. I mean, Boston is a particularly culturally deprived town, I should say. This is one of the few places in the country that I know of that doesn't really, well, not few, but it's one of the places in the country that does not have a really functioning community radio system. Many places do. Now, here there's this station, but it's not, and it's good that it's doing something. But by comparison with what's done in other places, it's not much. And in fact, what we don't have here at all, as far as I know, there used to be, but it's more or less gone, is participatory community radio. Not just I turn it on and you hear something different, but you actually participate in it. That's real community radio. And they have that in a lot of places. And traveling around the country, you can see the difference. I mean, towns that have it, just, people are less isolated, they sort of know what's going on, they have a way of getting together and communicating. Boston is unusual, and it's a very scattered, there's plenty of activists around here and people interested in all sorts of things, but it's very dispersed and scattered. There's nothing much that, you want to find out what's going on, you got to sort of find a leaflet somewhere.
Pacifica talks about, donating money to offset the cost of big transmitters and stuff, but just before I came here, I clicked on something in the Pacifica Radio Archive of the Net, and I heard, 5-minute excerpt of your review. Now, you consider yourself a Luddite, but my question is, do you find the role of the fact that, we could post the Pacifica Radio News all half hour on the internet, and you can click on and listen to it?
It's been a big difference for people. I mean, the internet is sort of a mixed bag in my opinion. First of all, take a lot of what I said tonight was indeed on Pacifica. Not on National Pacifica, but on WBAI in New York, which runs somewhat its own show and is a bit more independent than National Pacifica. So as far as I know, I don't know, but I doubt that, well, actually it may have even, I'm not sure it went over National. I think it was just BAI, I'm not certain. But there was discussion about this kind of thing, which you would certainly never hear over, say, NPR. I mean, inconceivable. Actually, I have to back off on that. NPR on the East Coast, you wouldn't hear it. If you go to NPR farther away from the main centers, you actually do hear it. The degree of ideological control and, the sort of commissar-like control of the news is much more striking in places like Cambridge, which are liberal ideological centers, where people are very much attuned to the need for not letting things get out of hand. When you go off into the sticks, it sort of does loosen up, and there will be things you'll hear in Oregon and Iowa and so on over NPR that'd never make it here. But we like those things. And as far as the Internet's concerned, yeah, it has been a way for at least a relatively privileged sector of people, and remember, anybody who's in the Internet is pretty privileged. Yeah, they've have access to a lot of things that aren't otherwise available. That's made a difference too. I mean, on some of the issues that I've been very much involved in myself, like East Timor, just made all the difference in the world. I mean, up until these communication systems were around, there was a couple of dozen people involved, and all of a sudden it blew up into a big movement. Partly because you could get the Australian press, which happens to cover the issue a lot.
We're on time there.
10 more minutes.
If you have time for maybe 2 more questions.
Yeah.
Well, no, I wanted to ask you questions. I'm going to try to make it quick. Patrick Buchanan appears on this week's issue of Time. Can you comment on the lack of analysis of fascist movements in the United States, like him and Louis Farrakhan and so forth and so on? And do you have any comment on the death of George Seldes and Will Kunstler?
Well, George Seldes had a very honorable record. It was some years ago. I think he was in his 90s when he died, so you have to go way back. But when I was a kid, for example, I read his journal all the time, in fact, back in the 40s, and it was, he was a really good independent journalist. He ran his own show, it was his own journal. I don't know if he ever made it into the mainstream, but he certainly did very important things. I don't remember how long that lasted. I think, in fact, probably died around the early 50s, I suspect, or something like that. But he had a really important role. It was kind of like I.F. Stone a few years later. Very good and important work. Bill Kunstler had a terrific record. I mean, he went down to the South at a time when it was really tough. He was nothing especially radical about him, just an honest, serious guy. He worked down there under extremely hard circumstances. It wasn't any fun being a lawyer down there in those days. He did terrific work, and then he, you can criticize this or that or whatever, but I think he, the whole record, when you look at it, is extremely admirable. As to the coverage of right-wing and maybe neo-fascist movements, I don't think it's been terribly good, frankly. I mean, but it's hard I really can't make a brief comment. I mean, there have been things that have been good. And there's been some attention to it. My own opinion is that the real lack in the analysis of these things is not being willing to look at why they're developing. So, like, say, take the militia movement. So after the Oklahoma City bombing, a lot of attention to the militia movement. But why? How come they don't have a militia movement in, Sweden or something? Why do we have it here? Well, does it have anything to do with what's going on here for the last 20 years? What's going on is pretty striking. There's been a spectacular redistribution of wealth. There's enormous, the country's just awash in capital. Profits are going through the roof, but it's very narrowly concentrated. Meanwhile, you take people like, say, Timothy McVeigh, who's supposed to have done the bombing. I don't know anything about him, but if you look at that sector of the population that he comes from, they've taken quite a beating over the past 20 years. Not by any laws of nature, it's not some laws of capitalism or anything. This is conscious social policy directed to rolling back the whole system of social support and solidarity and so on, whatever developed over the past years. And it's been a very concentrated campaign, and it's had a lot of effect. People of, say, Timothy McVeigh's background, like, say, white male high school graduates, that kind of category, have probably lost 20% of their income in the last 15 years as a result of very deliberate social policy. Those same policies that are putting plenty of money into the pockets of the super rich. Well, you know, they don't see what's going on. There's the corporate offensive, which has been incredible. The propaganda offensive is a big story in itself. I don't have time to talk about it, but things are beginning to come out about it, even a few academic studies. It's been astonishing over the past 50 years, picking up in the past 20 years. And one of its goals is to demonize government. They want people to hate government. Now, it's not because they don't, remember, they are the tools and tyrants of government, and they intend that to continue. So they want the government to continue pouring money into their pockets. So they've got to have a big, powerful government. On the other hand, it's a very good idea to get people to hate government. Why? Well, you know, there's plenty of things that the government does that are pretty awful and that you'd like to hate. But that's not why they want you to hate government. They want you to hate government for two reasons. One is because government is, because, as do we put it, government is the shadow cast by business over society, and it's better to have people look at the shadow, not the substance. So don't hate the Fortune 500, you know, hate government. Hate the tool, not the tyrant. You know, the other reason is that government has a flaw. It's potentially democratic. You know, potentially it can be influenced by people, and we even know how to do it. And it does work. So there are ways for people to participate in some fashion in affecting and influencing governmental decisions, and that's a serious flaw. If power shifts over into the hands of private tyrannies, which are totally unaccountable and are basically totalitarian institutions, it's perfect. Then there's no way for the public to do a thing. Like we can't decide, make any decisions about GE policy, let's say. And we can't organize to do anything about it except, you know, very indirectly. Like even in a totalitarian state, you can influence policies by disruption and, you know, all sorts of things. But there's no mechanism for doing it. These are tyrannical organizations, and that's long been understood, in fact. In fact, even their roots come out of the same background as Bolshevism and fascism, if you look at it. And if power can be shifted over into their hands, we're home free. You know, then there is no threat of democracy. That's a large part, I think the main part of the purpose of getting what's called, you know, devolution, moving power from the federal government down to state governments. I mean, the federal government is basically the shadow of big business, but state governments are even the shadow of middle-sized business. They're very easily manipulated by private power, a lot more than the federal government. So therefore, if you can get you can get block grants down to the states, you know, they're going to be so controlled by local business interests that that money is going to end up in the pockets of rich people. I mean, it more or less does anyhow, but it'll go far more in this case. So yeah, all of these are, anyhow, coming back to Timothy, the right-wing movements, yeah, they end up with a move of what's called anti-politics. Because if your life is collapsing and you don't understand what's going on and you just can't see the source of power because it's sort of, you don't read Fortune magazine, and you got drummed into your head over and over, actually for 50 years, this, you know, hate labor, hate the government, hate welfare mothers, and so on and so forth, what's called anti-politics, then you take it out on somebody. And you take it out on immigrants or, you know, black mothers or government offices. That's the only thing you see around that you can blame anything on. So I think, so what's missing in the analysis of the right-wing movements, I think, is the source of it. You know, it's not coming out of nowhere. It's not because people are crazy. You know, it's a very devastated society. It's full of cults. You know, fanaticism. People are isolated from one another. They can't figure out rational, constructive ways to respond to what's going on, and the end result can be pretty ugly. People like Pat Buchanan are exploiting that to the limits, but they're exploiting something that's real, and that's what ought to be discussed, not what he's saying.
Thank you. Next question.
Yeah.
I'd like to explore a minute here the dynamics of the corporate control that you're talking about, because you know, the corporations, there's not a monolith. There are corporations vying against each other. Mm-hmm. If I can get two examples just to clarify my point. I went to a talk over here by Professor Ted Popple, I believe. I think his name was Popple. He's a mechanical engineer. He used to work at the Pentagon. He did a study on the Patriot missiles.
Oh, Postal. Yeah.
Postal. I'm sorry.
Yeah, he's from here.
And in his study, he determined that, in fact, contrary to the administration and military claims, certain segments of the military claims, that not a single Patriot missile worked. In fact, not only did they work, it couldn't have worked. And in fact, not only it couldn't have worked, they knew it couldn't have worked.
See, I don't quite agree with him. Yeah.
However, what he mentioned is that he saw certain segments of the Army saying where, in fact, they were outraged that he would do this, people like Raytheon, but there were other segments who were equally outraged they would waste money on this.
Not waste money, not put it into their pocket.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
No, that's what I mean. That's what I mean. The dynamics of it. So that's the one, and then why did the one side win and not the other? The second example was this case of the FCC has two rules. One of them, you can't be a felon and have a license, and the other one, you can't be foreign and have a license. But GE has a license, they own NBC, and they're felons because they ripped off the government. And I think Fox is owned by Murdoch, who's Australian, and he has a license.
But he has an American citizen now.
Oh, does he?
He bought a citizenship.
Yeah. But there was a thing in the paper you see buried in page 20.
Yeah.
Now I was wondering if there was something more than honor among thieves, because there certainly is competition between the corporate sectors, and why does it seem that there's only really one voice that comes out at the end?
Well, first, there's some degree of competition. Is pretty restricted. Corporations were developed back in the early, late 19th century, early 20th century. There was a lot of reasons, but one major reason was to cut down the risk of exposing yourself in the market. If it's what's called cutting transaction costs in the technical literature. If you can internalize risk and free yourself from market discipline and put things under a very visible hand, then you don't have to, you can let the poor people face the market discipline, and you are freed up from it. There is some degree of conflict among the powers, but if you had a world of totalitarian states, there'd be some degree of conflict among them too. It happens that there's also a lot of interlinking and cooperation. If you look at the connections between big corporations and banks and investment firms and so on, it's interlinked in extremely complex ways. But you're right, there's some competition. When Postal said that he thought the Patriot missile didn't work, I didn't quite agree with him. I thought it worked fine. See, he's using, in my view, irrelevant criteria, whether it worked to shoot down incoming missiles. But that's not what it's for. What it's for, and anybody at MIT ought to know this, is to sustain high-tech industry. That's what we're doing here. The way you sustain high-tech industry in the United States is by a scam, which is conscious. So, the Secretary of the Air Force, Stuart Symington, under Truman, made it very clear back around 1948, I think, in congressional testimony. He said the word to use is not subsidy, the word to use is security. The business press explained completely at the time that high-tech industry cannot survive in an I'm quoting it, Fortune actually, in an unsubsidized, competitive, free enterprise economy, and that government must be the savior. And the best way of doing it, they quickly hit upon, was through the military for a number of reasons, one of which being you can fool the public into paying for it by scaring them. It's one of the reasons we're such a frightened society. So, and the Patriot missile is just one of the ways of pouring public funds into high-tech industry. It doesn't make a slight bit of difference whether it works or not.
Yeah,
because it's not intended to work.
There was another company.
Yeah, maybe somebody other. Sure, because there are other companies that would have preferred that it go into their pockets. Sure. And if you take a look at, say, the aircraft industry, which is called a private industry, which is just a joke, But if you look at Boeing and McDonnell Douglas and, the other industries which in fact are publicly subsidized, though they make private profit, sure, they're always competing with one another. In fact, what they're usually competing for is to get the government to work for them rather than their rival. There's a degree of competition, and in fact there's a degree of global competition, but even that's misleading. The interlinks globally are quite tight. And you don't have to take my word for it. The OECD, which is the outfit of the rich countries, they had a study just a couple of years ago in which they pointed out that in the contemporary international economy, what sort of drives things forward is oligopolistic relationships, big, huge, monstrous quasi-monopolies, which are interlinked with one another and are involved in strategic interactions with state governments. I mean, that's the core of the international economy. And yes, there's some competition there, like, you know, sometimes IBM will try to get something from Microsoft and so on. And then the question, well, why does it all come out with the same voice? Well, you know, it doesn't always come out with the same voice. But on issues where they have common interest, it's going to come out with the same voice. Actually, there's some very good, there's not time to talk about it now, but there's some very good work on American politics done by a really good political scientist, Tom Ferguson, who used to be here and is now over at UMass Boston. Years ago, he developed what he called the investment theory of politics, in which he tried to show that a good part, you know, not everything, but a good part of American political history, actually going back to the early 19th century, can be accounted for simply by looking at things like who's paying off the candidates, campaign contribution. And what it turns out is you get big blocks of investors who sort of get together and invest to control the state, and that's called an election. If the blocks of investors happen to have different interests, as they sometimes do, you know, like some of them might be more capital intensive and others more labor intensive and stuff like that, well, then you get disputes in the political system between the big blocks of investors. In periods when there really aren't any big issues, it's called a period, you know, like a historic compromise. There's no issues for years and years. Sometimes the issues are fairly substantial, like during the New Deal. There was a lot of popular input to the New Deal, big popular input, but there's also corporate conflicts. In fact, not unlike ones that are coming up now, in fact. So like big high-tech industry, capital-intensive, high-tech, internationally oriented industry was pretty supportive of the New Deal. In fact, GE was one of the, was initiating a good deal of the measures. It was okay with them. I mean, they wanted the labor force controlled. So they didn't want disruption. They wanted a controlled labor force which wouldn't disrupt their capital investment. So, pay them a little more money, not a big deal. On the other hand, groups like, say, the groups that are around the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, or the National Association of Manufacturers, which tend to be, lower tech, higher labor, more domestically oriented and so on, they were viciously opposed to the New Deal. And in fact, if you look at the lobbying positions of groups like, say, the NAM and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which represent what's called here small business, doesn't mean small, but, this kind of business, you compare their positions with those of, say, the Business Roundtable or the Business Council, which represents usually, the really big guys. There you find conflicts. In fact, you find them right now. Take a look at the debates over getting rid of the Commerce Department. Well, the lower level guys who don't care too much about, they sell things in Kansas and Iowa and they don't really care much about international markets. They'd like to see it go. On the other hand, the big guys want it to stay because they know perfectly well it's a big business funding program with export promotion and so on and so forth. So those conflicts are sitting right there in Washington, and they're historic differences, and you get conflicts in the press reflecting it. I mean, that's not the whole story. There are plenty of other things, but this is a pretty substantial part of it. So your point is right. There's some degree of competition and a lot of interaction, and there's a lot of common interests. So like on the stuff that I was talking about today, it's basically common interests. Although not totally. Like take, say, the oil companies. Oil companies are pretty influential in U.S. policy, the energy corporations, especially on the Middle East. And it's kind of interesting that on this issue, they've lost out. So they have been in favor of something like the international consensus. But they lost out in the internal debate. And that's pretty striking. It doesn't usually happen. And if you really look closely, not this kind of broad brush picture, but you really look closely, you find conflicts and sometimes even surprising things.
So is it that they're saying, okay, I don't like it, what's happening right now for my own interest?
Well,
in the end, if we allow this process.
Look, if you're an oil executive, and you have to travel down to the Arab world, and people are throwing stones at you, and they hate you, and so on, it's not very pleasant. You'd like them to like you. You don't have so much problems. And the big oil energy corporations, they've been smart enough to understand that if the U.S. had joined the international consensus on these issues, there probably would have been a diplomatic settlement a long time ago. And it's true, the U.S. would have lost this strategic asset and military force. On the other hand, their lives would have been easier. So for them, that was okay. And in fact, this was a big issue in the United States. I mean, like I mentioned 1971, but take a look at what happened. The Secretary of State, William Rogers, came from, kind of like oil corporation investment firm backgrounds. Henry Kissinger represented other interests, and there was a conflict. The Rogers Plan, the official U.S. policy was the Rogers Plan, which was essentially almost exactly what Egypt accepted. And there was an internal bureaucratic battle over that. The documents aren't out yet, so we don't know the details of what happened, but you can sort of make it out. Kissinger representing other interests, and even in this case, probably representing personal, just craziness, because his main enemy in the world was William Rogers. He wanted to take over the State Department. The Russians were sort of way down low beyond them. But for a lot of reasons, including some personal things, but also just real conceptions of how to run the world, which differed, and based on, like military industry, I think. It's called defense industry, but it's a lot of high-tech industry, pretty much supported the Kissinger position, I think. And certainly people like Henry Jackson and his center from Boeing, he used to be called. He certainly advocated those positions strongly and openly. And you had a conflict, and in that struggle, Kissinger won out. I think there were all kind of other reasons having to do with cultural factors in the United States and where American intellectuals were and so on. It wasn't simple. But it was by no means a sure thing. Could have gone the other way. So on some issues, yeah, there are conflicts within a pretty narrow range. But mostly you get a uniform voice because there's a uniform class interest. In 1787, that view achieved the virtually unanimous agreement of the framers of the Constitution. There was actually only one exception. And so the system was designed to protect the minority of the opulent from the majority and to ensure that there would be no threat of democracy. The ways in which this has been done are or should be well known. There have been many changes over the past couple of centuries, but that principle remains pretty much in force, and it has a consequence. The consequence is that there is no right to know. Rather, there is a need to control and manage opinion, because that's the only way to guarantee that the minority, the opulent, will be protected from the majority who otherwise might act in their own interest, and that's unacceptable. Well, there's a lot more to say about that, but let's move right on to the 20th century. By that time, a lot had changed. One thing that had changed was that extensive popular struggles and resistance had quite considerably extended the scope of democracy. One reflection of that is the extension of the franchise, and there are many others. However, while this was going on, something else was happening, namely actual decision-making power was being more and more concentrated. In fact, it was being concentrated in corporate institutions that are totalitarian in essence and were designed to protect power, protect the minority, the opulent, from market discipline, and large part of their point. And they were also being, by the early 20th century, being granted extraordinary powers by courts and by government, which had become more than ever the shadow cast by business over society, to borrow the phrase of John Dewey, a truism that simply echoed and restated in the mid-20th century points that had been made by many pre-capitalist and anti-capitalist thinkers, Adam Smith, many others, including, incidentally, James Madison, which again reveals some of the contradictions. A few years after the system that he had designed was in place, he was appalled by the outcome, and he condemned what he called the daring depravity of the times as the rising business classes, contrary to his expectation, used their power to become what he called the tools and tyrants of government, overwhelming it with their power and combinations and benefiting from its largesses. Take away the poetic rhetoric, and it's a pretty good description of everything that holds right up till today. In fact, today's Congress is one of the most dramatic examples of that American history reveals. Not the first one, but a dramatic one. Well, what was happening in the 20th century was captured rather neatly by Alex Carey. He's an Australian social scientist who actually pioneered the study of corporate propaganda, business propaganda. That's a huge force in modern life. It extends from the commercial media to the huge entertainment industry, to the enormous public relations industry, to advertising, schools, universities, in fact, about every aspect of the legitimate charge of selectivity in examples as much as possible is to just take whatever the lead story is in the preceding several days. That usually works quite well. And you know, it's not a total sample, but at least it's kind of a fair sample if you only have a few minutes. So let's take that one. Here there's no question. It's, you don't have to worry about what the biggest story is. You don't have to count words. There has been one overwhelmingly dominant story for the last few days, the assassination of Israel's Prime Minister Rabin. That's a central topic in U.S. foreign policy and ideology and power and so on. And there's a leading question. The question is raised over and over again, will the assassination throw a wrench in the peace process? So let's have a look at that. Well, actually, remember, just to stress that I'm not really interested here in the current history, in the specifics of the current history, but rather in another question, namely how they are presented, how they're framed, how they're shaped, and what all this tells us about the everlasting battle for the minds of men and how it's waged. Well, when you look at a question like that, there's three types of questions you want to think about. One is questions of fact, how are the facts presented? Second is questions of interpretation, like what do people say about them? But a third, and usually far more interesting question, is what are the presuppositions? That is, what is unexpressed? You know, what is the framework of discussion? What are the assumptions, the premises that bound the thinking that you're not supposed to subject to reflection or discussion, but that set the questions that can be asked in the ways you're allowed to look at them. That's almost always the most interesting and important aspect of any doctrinal system, and in case any of you are planning a future in any of these areas, that's the way to wage the everlasting battle for the minds of men. Set the presuppositions and you've won the game. So for example, in the old Soviet Union, if debate, say, over the invasion of Czechoslovakia or Afghanistan could be restricted to the question of whether the Russians acted wisely or made mistakes in their defense of Czechoslovakia and Afghanistan against terrorists and subversion. If that was the question, the game was over, and it didn't matter if you concluded that they made plenty of mistakes. Similarly, in, say, Hitler Germany, to go to the extreme, if the debate could be limited to the question of whether the Jews were indeed as much of a threat to civilized values as was claimed, or whether it was exaggerated, the game was over. It didn't matter what conclusion you drew. And that holds quite generally. Often it's reflected in the very terminology in which issues are posed. So the first question to look at, if you want to look at a doctrinal system, is just ask about how the questions are posed, what are the premises, what's beyond discussion, what's the terminology that's used, and so on. That's usually pretty much finishes the story, whether people happen to tell the truth or not. So let's take the fundamental question again. Will the assassination throw a wrench in the peace process? Well, peace process is a good thing. Everybody's in favor of peace, so therefore we're in favor of the peace process, and we hope it won't throw a wrench in it. And the answer to the question, I mean, the basic set of answers is already in life on quite a remarkable scale. Fortunately for us, its leaders tell us what they're up to. They are engaged in what they call the everlasting battle for the minds of men who have to be indoctrinated with the capitalist story. That's just standard sample from leaders of the public relations industry talking to each other, of course. And that position is correct on the principle on which the country was founded. If the minority, the opulent, are to be protected against the minority, the majority, and if the threat of democracy is to be deterred somehow, then this is really the only way. Force isn't available, and at an appropriate level, and even if it were, control over opinion is the fundamental means for ensuring that people accept rule, whether it's a military society or a totalitarian society or a more or less free society. Again, that's a truism that goes back to the same years, to David Hume's principles of government, in fact. So all that hangs together. Carey, describing the 20th century, points out that the 20th century has been characterized by three developments of great political importance: the growth of democracy, the growth of corporate power, and the growth of corporate propaganda as a means of protecting corporate power against democracy. That's a pretty accurate summary, I think, and he gives a lot of evidence to back it up. And we might simply add that the idea of constructing what he calls a propaganda-managed democracy is not only fully in accord with the principles on which the country was founded, but also with the thinking of leading intellectuals, progressive intellectuals, Wilsonian thinkers, academic scholars, and so on, right through the 20th century, in fact, right up till the present. The founder of one of the real founders of contemporary political science, Harold Lasswell, argued that we should not succumb to what he called democratic dogmatisms about men being the best judges of their own interests. They are not. In fact, because of the stupidity of the average man, we have to make sure that they don't try to exercise their technical options in a democratic arena. Rather, we, the smart guys, have to do it for them. And that's just for their own benefit. Any slaveholder would understand the logic, and it's familiar, in fact. The dean of modern American journalism, Walter Lippmann, one of the leading and most respected public intellectuals of the 20th century, and a Wilsonian progressive, he explained that in a democracy, the general population, what he called the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders, have to be kept out of trouble. In a democracy, they can be spectators, he said, but not participants. Rather, they have to be marginalized and dispersed so that the bewildered herd, as he referred to the general public, will not interfere with the work of the responsible men, people like him. Like others who have advocated these elevated ideas, he politely and wisely refrained from asking why he is among the responsible men, but not, say, Eugene Debs, who in fact was in jail. But the answer is not too hard to figure out, so I'll leave it as exercise for the reader. Well, there's a lot more to say about all these things, but the most important fact, I think, is that the basic principles have not really received a very substantial challenge. In fact, they get reiterated over and over in one or another form, often publicly and overtly, as in the examples I gave, often more significantly in actual practice. The basic principle is that the democracy is a threat, has to be stopped somehow. You can have democratic forms, but you have to make sure they don't function in such a way as to threaten the minority of the opulent and their power. And that means that the bewildered herd have to be kept that way. And furthermore, though it's true that this is, in Madison's terms, a prologue to a farce or a tragedy under the cynical name of popular democracy, nevertheless, that's the ideal. It's the ideal that must be sought. There's no right to know, there is a right to manage, and indeed a duty to manage the minds of men if we are to carry out successfully this everlasting battle to ensure that we control what they think and keep them out of trouble, out of the political arena, separated from one another, lacking exactly the capacities that Howard Zinn was talking about in those introductory remarks. There are, of course, conflicting values. That's a very important fact. And these are expressed, for example, in Madison's letter, and you find them running all the way through to the present. And the conflict between these conflicting values, that's been a central theme in the vicissitudes of democracy over the past several centuries, and it remains so. Well, let's descend from this high plane of abstraction and come down to practice, actual practice in the doctrinal institutions, of which the media are the ones most commonly discussed, but that's only because they're the most visible component and the easiest one to discuss. I think what you find in analysis of the media is rather general throughout the doctrinal system, journals of opinion, schools, universities, and so on. Some variation, but the major themes don't seem to me at least to vary very much. There's a lot of material on this topic in print, including studies that are about as carefully controlled as the empirical conditions allow. In my view, these studies demonstrate fairly persuasively that there is a systematic, sustained, and dedicated commitment to retain, to entrench the tragic farce of popular government without popular information that you can figure out for yourselves. There's lots of material to look at, and I won't try to review it. It would be impossible anyway, and a waste of time because you can do it better on your own if you're interested. So instead of trying to summarize what's available, let's just take a few samples. I've been asked to talk about this topic for many, many years, and I've always found that the best way to proceed and the one that eliminates the,
I'm Chuck Rosina.
And I'm Linda Pinkow. Together we produce No Censorship Radio and run the news department at WMBR. It's our unpaid job to bring Pacifica Radio to you every weeknight at 6 p.m. Pacifica Radio is the nation's first listener-supported, community-based radio network. Unlike other public radio, Pacifica is non-corporate, not beholden to any big institutions. As a result, they have to struggle financially, but they also have the freedom to really consider all things.
Pacifica News consistently covers the stories that are censored by the mainstream press. One example is Mumia Abu-Jamal. The commercial media barely touched the story, and when they did, they consistently referred to him as a convicted cop killer. National Public Radio considered running his commentaries live from death row, but canceled them under pressure. Another example is Fidel Castro's recent visit to New York. Mainstream media focused on how he looked and the comments made by Mayor Giuliani. Castro's speech was hardly rated a soundbite, but Pacifica aired the entire speech from the United Nations.
The money raised this evening will help to pay the costs for WMBR in Cambridge to broadcast the Pacifica News. WMBR is community radio at MIT. Although MIT provides us with studio space and some other amenities, most of our operating budget comes directly from our listeners, not through advertisers, underwriters, or the government. This means that our primary responsibility is to the listener. WMBR has grown and thrived over the years because our listeners are looking for independent voices.
Well, the obvious way to start a talk on democracy and the right to know is perhaps to try to find the least controversial comment that you can dig up about it. And the best I could do was a letter by James Madison toward the end of his life, around 1822, when he says that a popular government without popular information or the means for acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both. Well, that sounds fair enough, and one might ask who could disagree with that. There are people, for example, James Madison, not in so many words, but in principle. And that contradiction tells us quite a lot about American democracy and about the media. James Madison, as you know, was the leading figure in the framing of the Constitution, and in the debates leading to the Constitutional Convention debates, he emphasized that democracy is a problem. It's a threat to be overcome, and the new government has to be designed to bar that threat. The reason democracy is a threat, he stressed, is because the primary responsibility of government, I'm quoting, is to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. And plainly, if democracy functions, that's going to be hard to do, in fact, impossible to do. So he argued forcefully and, in fact, persuasively, and in the Constitutional Convention of